We're continuing to discuss the general principles that create speed. Having discussed all the different aspects that influence propulsion, we're now going to discuss everything that influences how to minimize drag. And minimizing drag is the other aspect of the speed equation, where you want to create as much propulsion as possible and create as little drag as possible. And so we're going to go over the different ways that swimmers tend to create drag, and then we're going to discuss how to best eliminate that drag. And so the first aspect we're going to discuss is lateral alignment. Issues in lateral alignment are typically present in freestyle and backstroke because the arm recoveries are happening one at a time. And as a result, they can come in from the side, and that's going to move the shoulders to the side, which in turn will move the hips to the opposite side. And then the opposite thing is going to happen with the other arm. It's going to send the shoulders back the other way and the hips the other way. And all of a sudden, the athlete's going to be wiggling through the pool. And when this is done really, really poorly, that wiggle can be really extreme. And when it's not as extreme, it still can negatively influence speed, even though it's not quite as dramatic. And so we're going to go over that in both freestyle and backstroke, what it looks like, and some things that can be done to try to minimize it. So we'll start with freestyle. And as you can see, where most lateral alignment issues are going to come from is the recovery and the breathing. And so if the arm recovery is sliding and entering in front of the head instead of right in front of the shoulder, as this athlete is doing, that's going to cause some side-to-side action with the shoulders. And if the shoulders are sliding from side to side, then the hips are going to slide from side to side. And all of a sudden, the athlete's wiggling through the water, and that's going to create a lot of drag. As so we can see with this athlete, they're entering the arms pretty much straight in front, and you can see the shoulders are rotating and the hips are rotating, but they're not really sliding side to side. And the only time there is some issue with lateral alignment is during the breath. You can see right here, the hips slide out right there, maybe a little bit more than they were when the head was down. There's going to be some deviation from lateral alignment, particularly with the breathing. However, the goal is to minimize it. And so, as you can see here, it does happen. And with lesser skilled athletes, this is an Olympic champion, it's going to be much more dramatic and much more significant. And so what you really want is the arms going straight in, the arms going straight back, and there's not any side-to-side action throughout the stroke. So another athlete here swimming at 50 meters speed, you can see the shoulders and the hips are rotating a little bit, but they're not going side to side. And so this is a good example of maintaining lateral alignment even at really high speeds. And so what can happen with some athletes is they really start cranking the tempo and the shoulders start going side to side a little bit instead of back and forth because they're just trying to get through it as fast as they can. This is a good example where you can see the torso, everything's staying straight in line, and everything's moving forwards towards the goal of getting to the other side of the pool. And this is with distance swimming, and you can see the shoulders and the hips, everything's staying pretty much in line. They're staying right in line with that line underwater. And you can see the one part where it tends to deviate a little bit is during the breath. You can see here the head's moving a little bit to the right, the hips are shifting a little bit to the left. You know, this is within the bandwidth of good swimming. However, you can see how it starts to happen, and with lesser skilled athletes, it's going to happen to a much greater degree. And that was with the athlete on the left. You can see the same thing on the athlete on the right. There is a little bit of a lateral deviation here with the breath. The hips slide a little bit to the left, and the breath slides a little bit to the right. But again, it's not a big deal relative to what could be happening with some lesser skilled athletes. So we'll take a look at it one more time. Hands in the recovering straight forwards, and you want the hips and the shoulders rotating instead of wiggling side to side. The last one here is another sprinter under the water, and you can see hips and shoulders, everything's kind of moving straight forward. There's not any side-to-side action, and this is a 100-meter race. This is, I believe, an Olympic final, and so this is everything at pretty much maximal effort and then still breathing, and you're not getting much lateral deviation. And so that's exactly what you want. You don't want the head to be pulling everything to the side when you breathe, and you don't want the arm recoveries coming across the body or out to the side, causing the shoulders to move side to side. Now we'll take a look at backstroke. And so what you'll see here is the arms are going in, and they're going in right above the shoulder. They're not entering behind the head. They're not entering to the side. And so when they do enter behind the head, what's going to happen is that's going to pull the shoulders to the side, and that's going to sling the hips to the other side. And again, now athletes are wiggling. And so what you really want is everything moving straight through the water as much as possible. And maybe you can see here, again, this is within the bandwidth of an issue. This is not a problem. It's just showing the dynamic. This right arm here is maybe a little bit more behind the head, And then this one is a little bit less behind the head. And you can see here, there's a little bit more of a side-to-side action with the stroke. And again, that's not an issue in this case. It's just showing you the dynamic of when the hand enters a little bit behind the head, it can change the body position, and that can cause potential problems when it's excessive or dramatic. So we'll take another look from this angle. Again, the hands are entering straight over the shoulder to the side of the head, and there's not a lot of lateral deviation. The shoulders aren't moving side to side. There's not a lot of wiggling, and the hips never move outside the shoulders. These particular athletes, they do a little thing called the hip slide. It's something that's pretty advanced, but to me this is, and so the hips do move a little bit side to side, but that's not wiggling. That's something that they're using to get a little bit more out of each stroke, something a few elite male backstrokers use. That's not the same thing as the hands entering behind the head and causing the hips to slide out to the side. These athletes are keeping the hands entering straight overhead, and that's keeping their alignment in check so that they can slide through the water and not create any more resistance than they need to. So you can see here, this athlete, hand enters right behind the shoulder, and there's not a lot of side-to-side shoulder action that's going to cause the hips to wiggle and cause a total loss of alignment. Hand entering straight so that there's no side-to-side torque, and that's going to allow him to move straight through the water without disrupting his alignment. So another view from overhead, and you can see hands are entering shoulder width, not crossing over behind the head, and you can see that their hips are not sliding out to the side. They're rotating, and they're rotating really well. The hips are moving, but they're not going side to side. These athletes are not wiggling through the water, creating a lot of extra drag that's totally unnecessary. Doing so is going to allow them to maintain their speed because they're not creating extra resistance. And so they're going to get more out of each stroke, not because they're creating more propulsion, but because they're eliminating drag. See it in a little bit slower motion here. Again, one final view from underneath. You can see hands entering right over the shoulder. Hips are not sliding out to the side. Shoulders are not sliding out to the side. There's really, really good lateral alignment, which is going to help minimize drag and help get as much out of each stroke, much speed out of each stroke, so that athletes can swim as fast as possible. So the biggest issue, especially in freestyle and backstroke, is managing the arm recoveries to ensure that they enter straight in front of the water, typically around shoulder width, and then making sure that they're not sliding out to the side or moving to the side, so that there's no torque that pushes the shoulders side to side, which then in turn is going to push the hips side to side. And so the more athletes can move straight through the water without going from side to side, the more speed they'll create. And again, that almost always comes down to the recoveries in freestyle and backstroke and making sure that they're direct and they're not going from an angle, and that will keep everything moving straight in line. We are continuing to examine the general principles of fast swimming, and we're focusing on minimizing drag, and specifically we're going to look at horizontal alignment. The more horizontally aligned a swimmer can move through the water, the faster they are going to swim. And so it's not only important to understand these concepts, it's important to be able to see them, because ultimately coaching is a visual art, and you need to be able to see what athletes are doing and being aware of what they're doing, and then designing interventions to help them improve how they swim. So let's get into horizontal alignment and see what it looks like in all of the different strokes. So in freestyle and backstroke, horizontal alignment is pretty static in that athletes are not moving up and down. They're hopefully trying to achieve a stable alignment that is horizontal on the surface. If we see this athlete, head's in line, hips are at the surface, legs are at the surface, you can see pretty much a straight line with their torso, and they're maintaining that position throughout the stroke. And so that's key in freestyle and backstroke, is establishing a great position and then simply maintaining it. We'll take a look at sprint freestylers here. You can see heads down, hips are up at the surface, feet are up at the surface, everything's moving in a line down the pool. Just like with distance freestyle, same basic idea. That static position, that horizontal alignment is achieved, and then it's simply held throughout the course of the stroke cycle and the course of a lap. So getting athletes in position is the first key step, and once they're there, they just have to maintain it. And so a lot of times what you might see is the head's up, the hips are a little bit low. That's probably the biggest issue you're going to see with horizontal alignment. Again, get them there and then help them stay there. Now we'll take a look at a backstroke athlete. You can see feet are up at the surface, hips are up at the surface, head's at the surface, and everything's in line. And so again, it's critical that athletes establish these positions, and once they do, it's simply a matter of maintaining it. So alignment in freestyle and backstroke is more of a static skill as opposed to one that needs to be managed dynamically. Once these athletes get into the positions, then they simply need to maintain that. And so errors you tend to see, hips are sinking really low, heads up really high. Those are the typical issues you see with horizontal alignment, especially in backstroke. Now, when it comes to breaststroke, things get a little bit more interesting because athletes have to come up out of the water in order to breathe, and then they have to put the head back down and get back into alignment. And so they're necessarily going to have to disrupt alignment. There's going to be an up and down undulation. The key is to ensure that that undulation is optimal. It's enough to get the job done in terms of creating propulsion, getting air, but it's not excessive and creating drag that doesn't necessarily need to be there. So as we watch here, what we'll see is that they're going to come up for the breath and they're going to get right back down into alignment. And so watch the athlete's hips here, as when they breathe, the hips tend not to drop at all. They slide forward a bit, but they don't drop. And so that's key in order to maintain horizontal alignment. The other aspect of it is after the breath, you can see the head and the chest, everything's pressed back down into alignment. And that's also key to reestablish horizontal alignment between each stroke. And so a lot of athletes will make the mistake, they'll take the breath, but they never get back into alignment with each stroke. And so the two key things are keeping the hips up as opposed to letting them drop, and then making sure athletes are getting back into alignment after each stroke. Another key aspect of horizontal alignment in breaststroke is maintaining the streamline of the legs for as long as possible. So you can see this athlete here maintains really long legs all the way through the pull, and then at the last minute, then they bring them up and they bring them down. And so what's key is minimizing the time until the legs are recovered, and that'll help them maintain horizontal alignment. And then once they do bring the legs up and recover the legs, they need to kick really fast to get out of that position as fast as possible. And so this is a 100-meter race. Things are happening really fast at high stroke rates, but the athletes are able to execute all of these skills. They keep the hips up when they breathe, they get back into full alignment, and they keep the legs long, delaying the kick until they have to, and when they do kick, they kick fast. We'll see these same skills during a 200-meter race, and they'll just be more exaggerated because there'll be more time between the stroke segments. So again, really long legs during the pull, and then once the kick is initiated, the recovery happens fast, and then the kick happens fast. And then they're back, the head down into that streamline position as long as possible and as quickly as possible. And so the difference here is there's going to be more gliding, there's going to be more patience, but the same positions are achieved. Horizontal alignment is maintained for as long as possible. It's deviated in order to breathe, but then they get back into that position as quickly as possible and as thoroughly as possible. So again, those are the key things you're looking for when trying to maintain horizontal alignment. It's really key. You have to understand that they will be disrupted, but you can minimize the time of the disruption and you can minimize the magnitude of the disruption. And the better swimmers can be at that, the faster they're going to swim. So next is butterfly, and you have the same thing going on in butterfly as you do in breaststroke. So athletes are going to need to break their undulation for two reasons. One, to breathe, and two, in order to recover the arms over the surface. So the key skill in butterfly is maintaining the hips at the surface during two key points of the stroke. The first is when the arms recover, and so the hips come up to the surface, and that allows the athlete to effectively recover the arms over the surface. And then the second aspect is when the hands enter the water, the hips need to be kicked back up to the surface in order to maintain horizontal alignment. And so one of the challenges swimmers will face is when they breathe, they tend to lose a little bit of horizontal alignment because the head is up high and the hips are going to be a little bit lower, but then they don't get back into the position where they get back aligned in the front of the stroke, like right here. And so what athletes will do is they'll start to swim a little bit vertical as they move through the water, and that can cause a lot of extra drag. The other issue that you sometimes see is athletes excessively press the chest. While they do get the hips up, pressing the chest excessively is going to create more drag as well. And so that can be a problem where they create more resistance than they'd want because they're undulating too much. And not only does it create more drag, it's going to slow them down because it's going to slow their stroke rate, which is going to mean it's more time before they can create propulsion again. So that's a problem as well. So again, the two key skills are keeping the hips up during 2 points of the stroke, during the front of the stroke here, and then during the finish of the stroke here, and then making sure that they're not undulating too much during the front of the stroke. So those first two examples were 100 butterflyers, and this is more of a 200 butterflyer. And so what you see is you're going to see a little bit more undulation in the front because they have more time to do so, but you're going to see the hips stay up at the surface during the back of the stroke right there and during the front of the stroke right there. And so the hips are staying up at the surface and keeping everything aligned throughout the stroke. And so while you might see a little bit more undulation in the front of the stroke, it's still not excessive, and the athlete can quickly and easily get out of that position. And so that's probably when undulation is a real problem, is when athletes get stuck in the front of the stroke like that. So we'll watch another athlete here. You can see a little bit more press of the chest here, but the hips are coming up, and the hips are staying up in the back of the stroke and in the front of the stroke, and you're not seeing this great drop in alignment. Now, as you can see in this position here, there are necessarily positions in butterfly where they will lose alignment. And so the key is to get out of those positions as fast as possible and minimize the magnitude of those positions by keeping the hips up, by kicking hard, and staying low with the breath. And so those are the two key aspects of maintaining effective undulation and maintaining effective horizontal alignment. So the last stroke we'll take a look at is underwater dolphin kicking. And underwater dolphin kicking is a little bit interesting because you have the undulation that you see in breaststroke and butterfly, but you don't have the breathing. And so they definitely need to undulate in order to create propulsion. However, they're not going to have that same excursion because there's not going to be a breath. And so they should be able to keep things a little bit tighter. If you watch athletes here, so everything is moving pretty straight and everything is in alignment. There's not these big kinks and there's not a huge arch in the back. That's probably the biggest thing that you'll see, is that there's a huge arch in the back when athletes are trying to kick effectively underwater. The other thing that you might see sometimes is a lot of undulation, and that's going to be problematic as well because while the athletes may be creating more propulsion, they're probably creating even more drag. And so as you see here in this athlete, everything's pretty straight. You have that undulation, but everything's moving straight in a line, and the body line is really good, and they're really horizontally aligned. And that's what's really important, is keeping everything straight, keeping the spine relatively straight, but then undulating around that straight spine as opposed to having a big arch in the spine or undulating excessively. And so same thing here. Everything is moving straight through the water. There's undulation, but everything's kind of balanced and it's moving straight through the water and everything's aligned. And so those are the key aspects of underwater kicking in order to maintain horizontal alignment, reduce drag in order to create as much speed as possible. So hopefully you can see these skills. They are critical and they're typically overlooked by coaches because they're a little bit more difficult to address, and also they tend to be subtle. So a small change in body position can often have a really big impact on speed. And so being able to see these issues and then being able to address these issues is really key for helping your swimmers improve as much as possible. We're going to go over the third way that athletes tend to disrupt their alignment and create a lot of drag, which is when they breathe. So unfortunately, athletes are going to have to breathe in breaststroke, butterfly, and in freestyle. And when they do, they're necessarily going to disrupt their alignment because they're going to move from a horizontal position. They're going to come up at least slightly, and that's going to cause problems in terms of their alignment. And so the skill is not necessarily in eliminating drag, but it's minimizing it by keeping the breath as small as possible. We're going to go over what it looks like, some of the common errors athletes make, so that you can better see these in the swimmers that you coach. So we're going to start with freestyle here. And what you're looking for is you want athletes to breathe as low as possible, as straight as possible, and as fast as possible. And that way it reduces the impact of drag. So as you watch here, if this athlete takes this breath and they do it pretty straight, but if you think about their breath moving further to their right, that's going to shoot their hips out of alignment, and that's going to cause a lot of problems. Their shoulders are going to move out of alignment as well. And so that breath needs to be as straight as possible. This athlete's doing a good job staying low, but if that head comes up high, then that means the hips are going to go down, and so that's going to create more drag as well. So again, straight and then also low is what we're really looking for. And the third aspect is it needs to be fast too, because the longer that it takes, then that means any errors that there are just going to be magnified. So for any amount of drag that's induced by the breath, the longer it takes, the more drag you'll get. And so low, straight, fast. And this athlete's doing a very good job with that. So we'll take a look from overhead. I want you to watch the swimmer in the yellow lanes to the right, and we'll watch his breath. What you see, so he just took that breath, and you can see how the head's slightly to the right, and the hips are going to slide slightly out to the left, And this is within a normal breath, but if it was magnified, you can see how that would pull the athlete even more out of alignment and cause more problems. And so again, everything needs to stay low to keep the hips up, but it also needs to stay straight to keep everything in line. And again, the faster that happens, the less drag that's going to be created. So low, straight, and fast, especially in freestyle. So now we'll take a look at it underwater, and you can see how that head's not moving up at all. The breath is really fast, and it's not pulling to the side. And so it's moving straight on the line, it's staying really low, and it's staying really fast. And as you can see, there's no corresponding change in the hip position, and that's what we're really looking for. So a breath that doesn't influence the body position because it's low, it's fast, and it's straight. And so that's what we're really looking for here in freestyle. And so when athletes can work towards that, it's going to help them be a lot more effective in reducing the amount of drag they create, and that's going to help them swim faster. Next, we'll take a look at breaststroke. So with every stroke, the athlete has to breathe, and they are necessarily going to come up out of the water. And what the athlete needs to do is make sure that it's not a purely vertical motion, that they're coming forwards, and that's going to prevent their hips from sinking in the water. And so you can see these athletes here, when they breathe, there's got to be an up motion, but it's always forward. It's not directly up, and that's going to help them keep their hips up at the surface. So if we watch breaststrokers underwater, what you'll see is if you watch the athlete on the left, he's breathing now, but his hip position hasn't really dropped. And so he's doing a really good job of breathing, but making sure that everything goes forwards so that he's not letting the hips dip when he takes that breath. And so that's what's really important here, is athletes will have to breathe, but can they do so in a way that doesn't cause them to lose their alignment? So moving forwards with the breath, letting the hips stay up at the surface, that's going to be the key skill here. So in a longer race here, you can see hips stay up at the surface even when the athletes breathe, and that's going to be really key to maintaining their alignment. So the breath is forward versus directly up, and they do so in a way that keeps everything in line as opposed to letting the hips drop when they breathe. And so if athletes are struggling to do that, they're going to be creating a lot of drag, especially in breaststroke, where there's already a lot of drag in the stroke, and it's going to make the situation even worse. And so breathing can be a real challenge for breaststrokers. And so not only do they need to keep it forward, they need to keep it appropriately low, and that's going to depend on the athlete. And more importantly, they need to get out of those positions fast, because it is going to create a lot of drag even when they're doing things really well. And so if they can minimize the impact of the breath, that's going to be really helpful for them as well. As with breaststroke, a similar thing is happening here in butterfly. When athletes need to breathe, they need to find a way to keep everything in line as much as possible. The head is necessarily going to come up, which is going to lead to the hips dropping. However, they can minimize that by, one, accurately timing the kick here, so you can see how watch here, the kick is going to keep the hips up at the surface. Two, keep the breath low, so the higher the head. You can see this is not necessarily a great position, and this isn't a technical flaw, it's just this is the nature of the stroke. But the higher you get the head up when they breathe, the lower the hips are going to go. And one, that's going to create more drag, but two, they're going to have a better kick here to keep the hips up at the surface. And so that's the real challenge here with butterfly. Breathing low, breathing at the right time so that the kick can help keep the hips up at the surface, and then also getting the head down at an appropriate speed so that the athlete can minimize the time that they spend in that position, which is going to be causing a lot of drag. And so this is a pretty streamlined position, but as you can see, there's going to be an arch in the back, and that's going to create some drag no matter how effective the athlete is at getting out of those positions. And so again, making sure that the breath is low and fast, and then timing it well with the kick so that the hips can stay up at the surface as long as possible. This is a 200 type stroke here, and you'll see the same thing. The athlete does a really good job of staying low when they breathe. You can kind of tell that the shoulders are just breaching the surface. The hips stay up at the surface pretty well, and this is probably the least best position, and it's still pretty horizontal in the water. So as much as possible, keeping the breath low and then timing it so that the kick can keep the hips up at the surface during the breath, and then getting the head down relatively fast in order to ensure that that position is minimized so that the positions of maximal drag are minimized as much as possible. So again, the breath is barely coming out of the water. The kick is keeping the hips up at the surface, and then the head's coming back down to the water pretty quickly, and that's going to make a big difference in terms of minimizing drag. So breathing is something that's going to happen in order to get the oxygen athletes need to be able to fuel their efforts. And if athletes can do that in a way that minimizes the amount of drag they create, and that's usually by breathing low, breathing fast, and in the case of freestyle, breathing straight, that's going to help them minimize their drag. And so breathing is about doing less, not more. As much as possible, you want the athletes to hide their breathing. And the more they can do that, the more effective they're going to be at minimizing drag. Talk about a little bit more difficult concept, which is that of maintaining alignment continuously throughout the stroke. And so the challenge is you can't really see it, but we're going to try to go through some videos and think about it conceptually. And so what it is it's athletes need to maintain their alignment as they shift from positions, and usually this requires a lot of really subtle changes in alignment and maintaining an effective way to move through the water, even though they're changing their position in the water. So when they're rotating or when they're undulating, they need to be able to maintain alignment as effectively as possible, even though they're shifting their position. And that can be really, really difficult. And even small and subtle changes can really add up to losses of speed. The challenge is you can't necessarily see them, but the athletes that are going to be more effective are going to be better at switching from position to position and do so in a way that maintains alignment. So what we'll go through is some of the danger areas that athletes experience. And even if we can't see these changes happening, we can appreciate that they do exist. And with an understanding of what is happening, whether we can see it or not, we can start to design strategies to actually make a change. So we'll start with breaststroke here. And you can see this really great straight alignment. The challenge is maintaining as much of that alignment and maintaining really subtle adjustments in that alignment through the breath and then back into the position. And so there's going to be a lot of different slight, subtle opportunities to make errors and then therefore opportunities to make corrections. And so while it's obvious that the breath needs to stay relatively low in order to facilitate alignment, how athletes get to the breath matters as well. And it's going to be a lot of slight, subtle adjustments that make a big difference there. Likewise, how they return to the breath, it's not just the final position in alignment or the final position during the breath, it's that transition between them that need to be really effective too. And so athletes have to be tuned in to what they're feeling and how they're sliding through the water, and if they're creating more drag than necessary as they go through that. And so we'll see the same thing at a little bit more speed here. And so again, it's not just that final position that the athlete gets into, and it's not just the final breathing position that they get it to, it's how are they managing that transition between the two. And there's going to be small losses in speed when that transition is not managed as well as it could be. The challenge is you can't necessarily see them, but if we use the right strategies, hopefully athletes can learn to feel them. One more example here with breaststroke. So again, good alignment, but they've got to transition out of alignment and they've got to transition back into alignment, and there's a lot of opportunity to have small errors that add up to big losses in speed. So same concept here with fly as with breaststroke. They're in that aligned position and they've got to come out of that aligned position, and that transition from alignment to breathing is what's going to be really key for minimizing the drag. And so if the athlete comes up a little bit too soon, or they come up at a little bit too sharp of an angle, or they got dive down too soon and they dive down to too sharp of an angle, or they delay it a little bit, even fractions of a second, which may not be visible to you, are going to have a negative impact on speed. And so it's important to appreciate these changes, because a lot of times athletes that move through the water more effectively aren't doing one thing a lot better than someone else. They're doing a lot of little things better than someone else. And so being aware of this, then we can start to design interventions that help athletes learn how to manage these skills a little bit better. But the transition to the breath here, and then the transition back out of the breath, there's going to be a lot of opportunity to do things well, and then opportunity to do things with less effectiveness. So same concept here, just a different race. Same concept here with backstroke. We're now just dealing with rotational changes as opposed to undulatory changes. So it's the same idea, it's just going to be a different movement. And so when the athlete goes from side to side, They need to make sure that they're doing so in a way that's smooth and they're not losing any of that alignment, even if it's subtle, even if it's temporary. And these changes may be very, very small, but they can still have an impact on speed. There's a lot of room for error when they shift positions, because if they don't shift them at quite the right time, or they shift out of alignment and then right back into alignment, that's still a delay in speed because of a loss of alignment. And so same thing here. And it could be that their hips drop because they're rotating. It could be anything. It could be that the hips move out of. It could be that the kick moves out of alignment. It's a lot of different things that could go slightly wrong when athletes are trying to shift position. So it's not just about getting into a horizontal position. It's about managing that as athletes move from side to side to side. And sometimes this isn't necessarily a purely technical issue. It may be also a range of motion issue or a stability issue. They may not have the strength to maintain their positions, or they might not have the mobility to maintain their positions in the way that would be ideal. And so managing this process is really key. It's not just about getting into good positions, it's about staying in them and then transitioning effectively from position to position. As with backstroke, freestylers need to manage this positional change with their rotation. As they shift side to side, they need to make sure that they're not rising up. They're not need to make sure that they're not moving to the side at all. They need to make sure that everything is staying smooth and they're not losing any of their position that they've established as they make that transition. And so they may end up on a really good position when one arm enters the water, and they may end up in a really good position as the other arm enters the water. However, in between those two, they may lose that position even subtly and even slightly. And those changes add up over time. And so it's really important to appreciate that things can go wrong even if they end up in the right positions at the end of it. It's not just where they end up and where they start, it's how they transition in between those points. And we'll see the same thing here with an endurance athlete that is swimming at slower speeds. It's that transition from side to side, from side to side, making sure that the hips are staying at the surface. They're making sure that the whole spine is staying in a line and that there's not any extra activity that's creating more drag. And so again, it's going to be a subtle change. It's not going to be one that you can necessarily see, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't cause problems, because the consequence of drag is really significant, and even small changes can add up. And if athletes are making several small changes, that can add up to make a big difference. And so the challenge with these concepts in general is that you can't see them, and they're kind of transitory and they're instantaneous. And so it becomes challenging to coach these because you, one, can't even know for sure that they're happening, other than in some extreme cases, and athletes can't necessarily feel them happen. And so the strategy is often to use activities that help them really feel and perceive these changes. And a lot of times you need to use some sort of training equipment in order to make that happen. And just real briefly, I've touched on it in some other videos, is strategies that can be really helpful are ones such as overspeed, where the drag is really magnified. Another strategy can be used is either wearing shorts, and so that way they feel the resistance, they feel the water flowing over their hips, they have more awareness of their hips, and then when they take the shorts off, they can really feel the water flow over and they have more awareness of what's happening. And you can use the same strategy with a t-shirt over their upper body. These are pretty unconventional strategies, but we're trying to solve a problem that's not really generally appreciated. And because it's one that you can't see, it becomes really challenging to help athletes learn how to manage it themselves, because you can't necessarily coach it. They can still learn it, but they have to learn how to feel what they're doing, and you need to use some strategies that help get their attention. So I understand this isn't quite as clear cut as some of the other drag videos in terms of the impact of alignment with horizontal alignment, with lateral alignment, and then also the breathing. But I think that this is no less important, even if it's not particularly obvious. So hopefully that was helpful. Good luck with your coaching, and keep it simple.